I've been west quite a few times, but this is my first time in Berkeley proper. So I've had a wonderful time in the short time that I'm here. I thank you all for giving me your viewpoints, your perspective, sharing your home with me for this short time. So thank you. I specifically want to thank Natalie Lagouche and the residents of the 1921 Walnut Street development before it was demolished. She brought the attention to me of Berkeley, and we talked on Twitter and virtually for months. And so I thank her for that conversation. I want to thank the Berkeley Architectural Heritage Association, and particularly Layla for hosting me at a virtual talk a few months ago. Harvey Smith for the wonderful tour and conversation that we've had today and for a long period of time. I also want to thank Monty Shah for her research and scholarship that was shared with me over the last few months. And that scholarship is amazing. Shada Chari from the Berkeley Faculty Association, thank you today and for putting this together. Travis Bristol from the School of Education, thank you so much. Caleb Dawson, thank you so much for your work and your stewardship. Josh Mandel for the assistance, and finally the Social Science Matrix for hosting this event. So just to set the tone, something you all know, but it's good to frame the conversation here we're having here. Berkeley entered, and this might be interesting for you all because, you know, from a national perspective, Berkeley entered the national headlines in a way that few would have imagined maybe a few years earlier. Much of this stems from the March 3rd decision of the California Supreme Court to uphold a lower ruling that forced UC Berkeley to make a cut to in-person enrollment. Now that number has started very big, has been dwindled down, but just the audacity of the cut brought significant attention at a national scale. At the center of the story sits the controversial Save Berkeley's Neighborhoods lawsuit, which argued that the university violated the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, by exceeding the enrollment numbers outlined in the university's long-range development plan, which poses adverse effects on the host community. And so with this ruling, universities across the country began to get worried to see the ripple effects, where a small group of disgruntled homeowners had successfully used the courts to halt a school's unregulated growth. The responses to this ruling were both swift and damning. UC Berkeley officials argued that this ruling put a roadblock on the pathway to upward mobility that is offered by public education, especially for first-generation students and students of color. Others highlighted that this use of CEQA gave litigious homeowners the power to usurp public authority. Moreover, the broad appeal to environmental protection reminded some of the tactics used in lily white neighborhoods to prevent the economic and racial integration of formerly exclusive communities. Ultimately, the story has been framed as a battle between selfish NIMBY homeowners and a benevolent public university trying to increase access to the American dream by increasing enrollments. But I'm here to say that this is only part of the story. The litigious appeal to CEQA here was certainly not ideal, especially given the face of those who pushed it. And given these plaintiffs' history, we must acknowledge that it seems that some of the plaintiffs would use any and all tactics to prevent any development in a state that is in dire need of more housing density. So we must acknowledge and be sober about that reality. But the lawsuit also reveals the limited recourse that residents have when trying to hold public universities accountable to their host communities. Consistent with national trends, California only finances about 13% of UC Berkeley's operating budget. In the name of serving the public, the university has turned to increase enrollments and profitable land deals to grow their wealth. But such approaches raise costs for students and draw on the resources and raise the housing costs for the host city of Berkeley. So when we look at a term like public good, we must also ask, who is the public here? Should the public, i.e. Berkeley residents, be forced to make inordinate sacrifices to serve the state of California's interest in public higher education? And if the answer is yes, that yes, sacrifices need to be made. We must ask sacrifices by whom and to what degree. Well, Berkeley is not unique in this crossroads about the benefits and costs of higher education institutions to our broad public. However, one defines it. And this controversy in Berkeley is part of a much bigger story. Right before our eyes, across the country, colleges and universities are the biggest employers, real estate owners, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in major cities and towns across the nation. With this, colleges and universities bring ideas and people together and generate new innovations. But also with such importance, we've also seen higher education's growing control over the economic development and urban governance in urban America, or what I call the rise of universities. This notion of universities is instructive because we must acknowledge and engage that while we focus on the educational benefits of higher education, both public and private, as a means to shore up the losses from state expenditures to public and private universities, because they both get public money, let's be clear about that. To shore up those losses, universities have engaged in non-educational profit-seeking endeavors that, number one, find campus expansions, raising housing costs and displacing residents in the neighborhoods of color that largely surround campuses nationally. Higher education's broad control over labor can lower wage ceilings and suppress collective bargaining efforts for whole cities. Nonprofit university medical centers emphasize profitable boutique services, high-profile research, or prioritize student services to the detriment of indigent care that is a requirement for their tax exemption status. And finally, campus police forces surveil and profile the same residents and are rarely held to public account. So even if every school in the country doesn't hold all of this power, we are witnessing a greater swath of our cities and towns being turned into a campus. How did we get here? What's the story? After World War II, cities faced the so-called urban crisis of growing Black and Latinx populations alongside white flight to the suburbs. It wasn't easy for schools to follow the money those many tried. So a group of urban universities lobbied for what's called the Section 112 credits program in federal housing legislation that helped make higher education the friendly face of urban renewal projects all across the country. Some called this Negro removal, as these efforts demolished Black and brown neighborhoods in campus areas. And in fact, alongside UPenn, UChicago, University of Alabama, Birmingham, University of Georgia, Berkeley is a part of the story. UC Berkeley used this federal program to acquire large amounts of acreage immediately south of the campus, which triggered the displacement of Black residents who lived in low-cost housing built for shipyard workers during the war. Moreover, one of the key plots of land that was purchased during this time was the property that would become People's Park. This land was purchased well below market value and largely targeted for student housing. However, UC Berkeley left large swaths of this land undeveloped or consistently rented out their housing units at above average market rates. So between 1964 and the mid-1970s, dormitory usage dropped and students were pushed into off-campus housing, which inflated land values in town and triggered acts of displacement, whereby we find today what had once been a 30% Black population has been reduced to about 6%. So if we talk about that's history, that's a long time ago, those public projects of property acquisition and displacement find consequences for the racial and economic composition of the town of Berkeley today and the university's control over that growing acreage in the town of Berkeley. By the time we get to the 90s, we witness a history of convergence. In the 90s, we see children of suburban sprawl looking back into the city. We have urban policies of underwriting tech and startups and quality like policing that we see more fervently in places like San Francisco. Cities began to compete for young professionals and empty nesters, and the universities began to try to compensate for shrinking state budgets. And this is where you have interest convergence. Universities looking for new money, retrofitting cities, turning them into campuses, and cities trying to also see the benefits of walkability, density, coffee shops, university lifestyle. So in short, we find many cities retrofitting their domains into campus-like environs. Now in the 90s, this wouldn't impact Berkeley in the same degree that it's happening now as San Francisco is becoming unlivable, unaffordable. Now we're finding Berkeley becoming a feeder community as a result of this history convergence in cities like LA, San Francisco from the 90s. So with this, we find a new economic framework, what we call the knowledge economy. Schools increasingly enroll more out-of-state and international students to generate greater revenue. They increasingly use academic research to create profitable commercial growth in goods or patents in a range of fields from pharmaceutical industries and software products. And if you think about UCSD, military defense weaponry, they deploy debt financing to build out amenities-rich clusters of high-end housing, retail, and recreation in older neighborhoods to compete for the best students, faculty, families, and residents in related industries. The campus, in short, has become a planning mechanism to build out universities by retrofitting neighborhood blocks to maximize wealth extraction based on land control, labor management, and the privatization of governance. What are the consequences of this directly for Berkeley? Administrators talk about the public benefits of increased enrollments. However, to this day, UC Berkeley only houses about 23% of its students. And landlords have seized on low campus vacancy by turning single-family homes into lucrative mini dorms that price out low to middle income residents. And now, as I said before, the expatriates from San Francisco's dot-com-driven housing inflation have also flooded Berkeley to further exacerbate the area's housing costs. When asked about building more housing directly on the main campus to mitigate this housing pressure, we hear talk about preserving the aesthetic beauty of the grounds. But on the other hand, we witnessed the increased build out of research laboratories like the Data Hub or the biotech building at the heart of campus that have the capacity to generate massive revenues with private pharmaceutical companies, tech, and life science industries. So we must continue to ask, public for whom? Public for whom? Let's be clear. UC Berkeley is now the largest real estate holder in California with over $2.5 billion in real property, which includes a 39,000 acre reserve system, the largest of its kind in the world. Many of these tracts of property, just to remind you, were purchased at below market value rate using the public power of eminent domain, while the school today provides little housing for low-income students or any kind of property inflation relief for residents. So in light of both unregulated enrollments and housing scarcity, what have been the public benefits of these massive land acquisitions? In short, UC Berkeley has used public power to become a private developer with little public oversight. In this story, I want to focus on two key areas in the time remaining: land and labor. The university's own press materials brag about, quote, being employing a private developer mindset, end quote. Just last year, Berkeley Capital Strategies, the real estate arm of the university, used the donation from a private developer to purchase the 112-year-old rent-controlled apartment building at 1921 Walnut Street. As a state institution, the school was able to override the city's rent control protections and build upscale student housing on that property. This is built into the state charter. There was an initial proposal to integrate student housing with the apartment complex, but now affordable housing for the city has been replaced with 400 square feet, fully furnished, one-bedroom units, this is the proposal, that start at $4,400. But not to worry, while furnished for one, these units can rent up to 3. So marketeers have been quite savvy to pitch this complex as addressing the housing crisis by targeting commuter students forced to live far from campus and offering scholarships to Pell-eligible students. However, there are no explicitly affordable or low-income units here for students, while the complex has taken away rent-controlled units from local residents in the town. Like other public and private universities, UC Berkeley has also leveraged the tax exemption of campus land to broker profitable development deals for the school and the commercial partners. These transactions generate wealth by passing the financial burden on to property tax-starved city budgets and by exploiting the local low-wage labor market. How does this work? For example, the new development, Berkeley Way West, is a new hybrid academic and speculative office building where private companies like Microsoft can benefit from the low-cost research and development of graduate student workers while also being sheltered from overhead costs with the nonprofit property tax exemption provided by a state university, as long as you can make the argument that the research is being done for educational purposes. Many of these buildings have no cafeterias, or they are staffed by private subcontractors, which allows a university and its private partners to reduce costs by sidestepping powerful campus labor unions. This tactic also helps suppress wages citywide because UC Berkeley is the biggest employer in the town, and so everyone must follow. If they suppress wages, then there's no pressure for other companies to increase wages. If they increase wages, then every other non-affiliated employer would have to follow suit. The CEQA lawsuit remains controversial indeed, especially when wealthy homeowners have become the face of the issue. But the case also has broad implications. The university has a stronghold on land and labor in Berkeley. The school's disinterest in building affordable student residencies has created an inflated housing market that displaces residents and low-income students. Instead of building out, so even though we see housing being built, instead of building out low-income housing for students or offering relief because of the housing pressures for residents, UC Berkeley has focused on converting its public land into expensive housing and commercial developments, which divert tax dollars into the hands of the school endowment and its private investors, but also away from the city budget. And then the university's shift to staffing subcontractors undermines the power of organized labor that largely comes from the working class communities of color that the increased endowments are purported to benefit. There is a crisis facing the college town of Berkeley that is much bigger than the Bay. Schools cannot be allowed to breach their long-range development plans through literal behind closed door agreements with a mayor who has state government ambitions and then call this all a democratic process. If schools are going to offset reduced state spending, which is a real pressure on higher education with increased enrollments, then they must build enough affordable, not just housing, affordable housing for those students. Public institutions also should never be allowed to use eminent domain to hoard land, but especially not in the middle of a housing crisis. When a public university, the largest landholder in the state, purchases a property, state law must not give that school the power to override municipal housing protections. When for-profit research is conducted on campus land, the property and the profits must be subjected to the appropriate taxation earmarks. And after years of stewarding what all agree has been a people's park purchased with the people's tax dollars, The university should not be allowed to swoop in and bulldoze a public serving park space in the name of student housing, especially when it holds acres of vacant land both on campus and throughout the town. The controversy here reveals as an issue much larger than public education. There is a struggle between autocratic control and democratic possibility. Right before our eyes, higher education has become one of the main engines driving today's economy, largely by using the language of the public good to consolidate public dollars and political power. However, this Ivy Tower prosperity has not been distributed evenly across the public. So we must ask ourselves, even if the issue is enrollment, what does it really benefit when we cede such autocratic control to a public university or to any university? And most importantly, what are the costs? This is not a story of student access, but a morality tale about the power and profits of university land control, largely in the name of the public good. We must gain sober eyesight and understand how higher education, whether public, private, or Ivy League, has become big business. And our communities have become their company towns. And there is a real cost to the other public, those who both on campus and beyond struggle to survive in the shadows of the Ivy Towers. Thank you.